officially known as the MEA nerd. So that is kind of my role. I do the money stuff and the budget analysis and those sorts of things. But Molly, I'll hand it off to you for a minute here.
Tanner's a brilliant economist. My name is Molly, she, her, 482 Forward. Before Tanner dives in, I co-chair the revenue committee and at MEJC, and just kind of level setting. So when Tanner's going to dive into the budget, one really important thing to understand is it doesn't have to be this way. Our state legislature is arguing over a flat budget and declining revenue. And it's really important to understand that, and it's not just for schools, groups like housing and transit and childcare. Everybody is asking, where is the money? And so the context of this budget we're about to talk about was argued until 5 a.m. because we don't have enough money to do all the things. But we could, because at the same time this budget was being argued and discussed and debated, the legislature was also talking about doing $5 billion worth of tax cuts and in tax incentives for big corporations. So as MEJC, I just think to sit with ourselves, like, it is our responsibility to grow the pie and to push people to grow the pie. The reality that we're in is that we're arguing over peanuts when we should be arguing over billions of dollars and trying to get everything funded. Instead, we're giving it away to Google and Facebook and Meta and GM and Ford, all of which you all know have the money to do with what they want. Maybe not for their lowest paid employees, but for their boardrooms. So I think just that's really important as you listen to Tanner talk. This budget was made while there was $5 billion worth of incentives being talked about, and we were talking about really a flat budget and declining revenue. So go ahead, Tanner. I just want folks to be centered in the fact that, like, it doesn't have to be this way, and we're responsible to make sure it isn't this way.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment, Molly, because I think that sets the kind of larger landscape here. It's been an interesting ride. It's been a roller coaster. Um, th there's a bunch of context around this, which is basically that uh, in Michigan, for a very long time, we've had a big chunk of debt on the teacher pension, the educator pension system called MIPSers. Okay, and that chunk of debt basically means that for every dollar paid to an educator, 21 cents had to be set aside to pay off that debt. Okay, that's a lot. That's a huge chunk of labor costs. It averages, in the ballpark of $3,000 per pupil. Now, an important thing here is that if a district decides to privatize, or if there's a charter school, they don't have to pay this. They're free riding on that system. And so there's distinct economic incentives and a financial advantage to charter schools and to districts that privatize. So MEA, labor, MEA, AFT, along with management, interesting, we don't always get along. We're used to fighting quite often, if you imagine that. We got together and we designed a proposal together. This proposal is, it's kind of a new idea, but it's also kind of not a new idea. Partially because it's strengthening a piece that would reduce the price of educator salaries effectively. It's also something that's advocated by the School Finance Research Collaborative and the recommendations, the adequacy recommendations. And those recommendations have, for MEJC and a lot of us in the education finance world in Michigan, have kind of been the North Star for, what is adequate revenue and what is equitable in the state. So we're all kind of in the ballpark, rowing in the same direction on, what is right here. Our Educators Coalition pushed really hard to kind of institute, this way of funding schools, kind of increasing base funding by reducing the effective MIPSers rate and thereby lowering the cost of educators' salaries to districts. We did get this in the budget. But it was really, really, really hard fought. There are pieces of this budget that are really good. There are pieces of this budget that I think are quite bad. And there are pieces of this budget that I go, why did you do that? You did not have to do that. So we can kind of start off with some of the headlines. The other thing I'll say here just right off the bat is you know, the Educators Coalition really had a strong push in this budget, but I'll say MEJC's priorities are really strongly reflected in this budget in a way I'm actually kind of surprised about. So, good job. So the kind of top line things that are going to be seen as negatives, I want to start with some of those, at least from the folks I talked to. So the first thing is that for the first time in over a decade, there is not going to be a foundation allowance increase, right? Foundation allowance, of course, is the per pupil grant, right? So the base way we fund schools is that each pupil gets an amount, a guaranteed amount from the state. Last year, I believe it was $9,700 per pupil. That increases every year, partially to try to keep up with inflation. Spoiler alert, it almost never does, but we try. Well, I tried. This year, there will not be an increase in the foundation allowance for first time in many, many years. Unfortunately, from my perspective, I don't know where you all sit, but there will be a foundation allowance specifically only for charter schools. So this, from my perspective, is super counterproductive because charter schools already have that financial advantage that we're trying to reduce over time, not increase. And second off, one of the big successes of the Whitmer administration was taking that foundation allowance, which actually used to be it used to be several numbers. There used to be different amounts if you lived in one place than another, and flattening that out so that now the vast majority of districts get the same amount per kid from the foundation allowance. This proposal actually would split that out again. And if you go to a charter school, you're worth more in the eyes of this budget. So I'm not a big fan of that, but that's what's in there. I do want to hit on a couple things that I think are MEJC priorities that got into the budget. One is just direct funding for MEJC, $4 million. There was a revenue ask, and that's in there. So good for you all. Another couple pieces. There's a 25% increase in funding for expanded breakfast and lunch. There is an 8.7% increase for at-risk. I don't love that term, but it's mostly economically disadvantaged students. So that's a big plus in terms of pushing the gas on equity. There's also a 26% increase in funding for English language learners. Another piece of like really kind of pushing the gas on getting those weights up higher. And I do just want to kind of note here in the last couple of years, the increase for it's interesting. Okay, so like back in 2011, funding for English learners was $2.8 million. Okay, then 2012 and 2013, they cut funding for English language learners completely. There was no funding. Okay. Then, funding stayed at a really, really, really low level for a long time. And then starting in 2020, 2021, 2022, we've like continued to kind of double English learner funding every couple of years until now we're going to be at about $50 million in appropriation. So we still got a long way to go. But I'd say the funding for English learners is probably like most improved in the past couple of years. So that's a big thing to be thankful for. The other piece, they retained a chunk of money for the student advocacy hotline, which is Perry's group. And then kind of the big structural change here, this isn't exactly MAJC's priorities. This is more around the kind of core of the budget, is the MIPSR's rate for districts effectively got lowered by 5.75%. So that's a basically the tax on educator salaries has been reduced from almost 21% down to, I think I forget exactly, it's what the number is. It's like 15 point something percent. So that's the disadvantage that traditional public schools now have compared to charters rather than the full 21%. So lots going on. There's still lots up in the air. I do want to hit on one more point, and that is kind of one of the big elephants in the room, which is 31 AA. 30. I don't make the names for these sections. Okay, there's a 31A that's for at risk. There's a 31 AA with two A's. That is funding for mental health and school security. In the past, it's been about $220 per pupil. In this budget, they cut it by 92%, which is very bad. From my perspective, it's doubly worse because they didn't need to do that at all. One of the things they did in this budget is they kind of socked away $250 million into a extra payment into MIPSers. Nobody was asking for this. We weren't asking for it. The executive budget wasn't asking for it. The House budget, the Senate budget, nobody was asking for this. This was just a way to kind of throw money away at something. So I don't particularly love that. The average effect for non-charter districts of this budget will be about a $250 per pupil increase, which is still good. That's netting out that reduction in the mental health grant, and sorry, I was looking at Trina's comment. It's netting out the 31 AA reduction and the MIPSers.
They just corrected their article title to at risk. Their main article was wrong. Their title was wrong. At risk funding did go up. The other one.
Who's writing the Chalkbeat articles? They need to call me.
I'm gonna go talk to them. They're down the hall.
Okay, I think that's the basic summary. I'm sorry if that is kind of too in the weeds. It's usually when I'm giving a budget presentation, I have more than a day to digest it. The sucker is a couple hundred pages, and there's been lots of changes. So this is kind of a more kind of raw, what actually just happened, than it is an actual summary and analysis of the meaty bits. So best I can do in a day. If we want, we could probably turn off the recording and then questions. Does that make sense?
Before we get to questions, so I just want to, just for the sake of keeping all this information in one place. Tanner, do you want to mention, or does somebody else want to mention the $4 million Black Student Achievement allocation? So for folks that don't, so does anybody want to talk about that?
Tanner, you briefly mentioned it. When Tanner said the money for MEJC, that money was a request from the African American Committee at MEJC, which was really a $15 million request to $4 million to do a series of participatory research targeting towards Black student achievement around school to prison pipeline, around really the districts that have been most harmed in the state, Black majority school districts, around divestment in education. So we got $4 million. It will go to an ISD, to be clear. It doesn't go to MEJC, it'll go to an ISD. Then we will work with that ISD to allocate that money towards districts and community groups to do the research.
Do we have a sense of which ISDs those are going to go to?
We have to talk to some ISDs now, so it has to go to one ISD. So we'll have to have some conversations.
Oh, just one. Got it.
As a network. And then it can go to many districts and organizations through an application process, but we'll have to figure it out. Yeah.
You got us all up here scrambling to be like, who can we get? Can ISD? No.
I've raised that one. So I'm curious. Yeah, does anyone have any just clarifications, other, questions, anything like that for Tanner? I did want to also make sure we touch on next steps, just so people are clear,
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, so just next steps, I think a pretty clear next step would be a supplemental. You could basically do a supplemental that takes this $250 million that they throw away into a one-time payment into MIPSers and almost fully fund the per pupil mental health categorical that they cut by 92%. So I don't know why they did it this way. A supplemental to restore mental health funding would be a clear win. It'd be $200 a kid for mental health services.
Okay, Charlie, did you want to just raise your question and then Alicia will do that too?
Sure. I saw a lot of conversation around giving tax cuts for film and TV production, which I think Michigan did in the past. And I think the MEA was advocating against this because it was going to, directly impact them. Do you know if that passed?
Yeah, I don't believe any of them passed. So there was kind of in the past month, there's been kind of 3 things that included tax cuts for the GM, Ford, Silicon Valley, and Hollywood. MEA, labor and management have kind of always opposed things that touched the school aid fund. Makes sense. It's a core to our interests. We're developing a new kind of thinking on this because of government has pushed costs from the general fund into the school aid fund. We're starting to realize in a more serious way that what affects the school aid fund is bad for us, of course, but also what affects the general fund can also be good or bad for us. And so yeah, no, we've been opposing those even with hold harmless provisions for the school aid fund.